Very good evening to you all, and welcome to this Christian Heritage webinar coming to you from the Round Church in Cambridge. We usually like to gather for termly talks and have a time of Q&A and interaction followed by a glass of wine. Unfortunately, we can't do that tonight, but I do hope you've got something, either something hot or otherwise beside you, and that you're doing well on this slightly chilly evening. It's a real delight to have you with us for this first installment of our autumn series, Humanity Matters, Re-enchanting Homo Sapiens. I'm going to introduce the format of the evening and then briefly introduce Andrew, who's known to many of you, but maybe not to all. And then we'll get into tonight's really meaty topic. So the format this evening will be 45 minutes. Andrew will share on the topic of Show Me Your Man and I'll Show You Your God, humans as the image of God. And then we're going to have time for Q&A. And you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you have a range of different exciting looking buttons. You've got the chat function. And if you do have any technical issues, feel free to chat with me and I'll try and get you sorted. You can also use the Q&A function throughout the talk to ask questions that may occur to you. If you like the question that somebody else has asked and would like to second it, you can uptick it or upvote it. And then when we break out into a Q&A session, you'll have the option either of typing in the Q&A tab, or you can raise your hand. You'll see the little button to do that, and I can give you the microphone, as it were, as well. Briefly to introduce Andrew Fellows. Andrew is the Director of Apologetics here at Christian Heritage. He was for 7 years a pastor in Bradford, England, before working full-time at L'Abri down in Gretham in Hampshire. For those of you who may not be familiar with what L'Abri is, essentially L'Abri is a network of communities scattered across the world, as far-flung as Korea, North America, England, Switzerland, are Christian communities which seek to provide a space and a forum for people who are asking ultimate questions, and to do so in community. And Andrew headed up the Gretham branch of L'Abri for 5 years, and during the course of his time there, had wide-ranging conversations and interactions with all sorts of people on the faith and non-faith spectrum. This evening, Andrew's topic is Humanity Matters, Re-enchanting Homo Sapiens. He's going to be speaking to us for 8 weeks running on Friday nights on that subject. And I just want to flag up that there is going to be a more interactive session after the last installment on December the 5th. So you're all invited to that as well. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Josh. Well, I appreciate you occupying this digital space with me and engaging my digital self. Those of you who know me won't be surprised when I say that this format of communication is extremely foreign to me. So please bear with me. And I say, in the words of Pink Floyd, wish you were here. But at one level you are. So let's get on with it. The great question this series is posing is this one: what is a human? It's the question King Lear posed in the Shakespeare play of his name. Who is it who can tell me who I am? And then it's the same question posed by the Hebrew poet in Psalm 8, who asked a similar question: what is man? Now, I believe this question is on the table like never before. It is critically important to engage. And it's interesting to me that today we're caught between a view of humans that is extremely positive, call it homo deus. Humans are like gods with infinite potential, especially in the technical realm. And the other side, homo sapiens, a species among other species with too much potential to cause havoc. In fact, many would argue our species, Homo sapiens, has caused more havoc with regard to nature than any other. So we're caught between these two poles, very positive and rather pessimistic. Now, I think if you listen carefully today, you can detect a growing dystopian outlook with respect to our species. And that intrigues me. I see this reflected in the arts, going back some 20 odd years, if not into the 30 years. My favorite film, Blade Runner. And in Blade Runner, what do we see? Replicants who are more human than the humans. And the depth of their humanness moves you deeply, but they're not really human. And then think about the Pixar film Wall-E. Earth has become a wasteland because humans have trashed it. They've been extracted to another planet. And a robot called Wall-E is the hero. And he's the hero against a backdrop of lazy, greedy human beings who aren't attractive at all. Some of you may have viewed the TV drama series Westworld. Wow. Here's a make-believe Wild West with hosts, who are artificial intelligence, that replicate humans for our entertainment purposes. And again, it's a pretty miserable portrayal of who humans are. So I think we can conclude, if we listen and watch carefully, that today we're beginning to doubt our species. There's a growing pessimism about what we are. And I would suggest that we're entering a period of disenchantment with respect to ourselves. This is actually the narrative behind the Extinction Rebellion movement. The idea is that the human presence on Earth has been a disaster for the rest of nature. And some, I could quote them, are actually advocating that human extinction would be the best possible outcome to save the planet. You can read the same disenchantment narrative in modern philosophers, especially what we call the philosophers of pessimism. They stand in the line of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, rather grumpy fellows, and are taken forward today with modern thinkers like John Gray and Thomas Ligotti. And you read these guys, they're deeply thoughtful, but you don't come away with a feel-good portrayal of human existence. Here's what Thomas Ligotti says. He says, from the beginning, it was a play, and by it, he means human existence. From the beginning, human existence was a play with no plot and no players that were anything more than portions of a master drive of purposeless self-mutilation. Doesn't exactly make you feel better before you go to bed. That's a negative portrayal of human existence. Now, I believe of all the questions that humans ask, and we ask many of them, this one is probably the most important in terms of the present moment. And I think there's a lot at stake in terms of the answer we give to this question, what is a human person? And I'll uncover this as I go along. Now, I think as we approach this subject, one of the challenges is the one of approach. How do you get at what a human is? And part of what I want to do through this series of talks is to get the question into proper focus. It strikes me today, everything is about specialization. And so we're naturally drawn to zooming in on things. So we ask, what is a human? And we zoom into the genome, the structure of our DNA. And of course, plenty of focus today on the brain, on our neurons, different hemispheres of our brain, accounting for how emotion works and memory works. We zoom in. But I'd actually like to make a case for zooming out as we approach our question. Because I think it's the panoramic view that gives the truer picture of what we are. The panoramic zoom out view adds depth to the portrait of what a human is. In his remarkable book, The Master and His Emissary, Ian McGilchrist highlights how zooming in leads to a vision of things that's mechanical. His argument is that this is what the left hemisphere does. It focuses in, and what it focuses on becomes mechanical. He says, our vision stops at the thing itself. The price is that the shearing away of the context, larger picture, produces something lifeless and mechanical. And I think part of the current dilemma in figuring out what we are is that we're always zoomed in, and what we find is a machine. The human is a machine. And I think this has contributed massively to the disenchantment. It's striking to me that when the Hebrew poet asked the question that we looked at the beginning in Psalm 8, what is man? In asking the question, he zooms out as far as you can possibly go. He says, When I consider your heavens, this is cosmic, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of him? And that's really big picture context, viewing humans within the cosmic horizon. And we know a lot more about that cosmic horizon than this poet did. Here we are in an immense galaxy called the Milky Way. And I find it rather hard to believe, but I'm told there are as many stars in our galaxy as there are grains of sand on planet Earth. Just boggles the mind. And the Milky Way is just one of many galaxies, perhaps 400 galaxies in the observable universe. Now, what does this immense cosmic viewpoint say about us as humans? Well, on the one hand, it communicates that we are very, very small. Small to the point of utter insignificance. So as you try to grasp the size of the universe, our existence as humans shrinks to the vanishing point. We're so trivial as to be non-entities. And of course, that does nothing to enchant our existence. And yet consider this. Here we are in this vast universe, and we're aware of it. And we're aware of it like nothing else in the universe is. We're awed to wonder as we see the grandeur of the universe we're in. And there is no other entity in all of nature that stands in wonder about the universe. And I would say that makes us rather special. As the Hasidic philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, "An ant is never stricken with amazement, nor does a star consider itself a non-entity. Immense is the scope of astronomy and geology. Yet what is astronomy without the astronomer? What is geology without the geologist?" Very striking point. Only we can stand in amazement. So when we zoom out, you see that we have the kind of existence as humans that can ponder things like the universe. So this abnormal mass of tissue inside our skulls is not just firing neurons. You could say we're the brain of the universe. We're taking it in. We're attempting to offer an account for it. And again, what else in nature does that? So yes, zooming out, getting this big picture may show our smallness and insignificance, but at the same time, it shows how unique we are. And humans, we who have the brain of the universe, we've probed the cosmos only to discover that it's perfectly suited to our human existence. What do you think about that? This is known as fine-tuning. As the English philosopher Roger Trigg put it, it almost looks as if the universe could see us coming and that life was central to the purposes of the universe. And he goes on, there are many cosmic coincidences such that if the initial conditions of the universe had varied only slightly, conditions for human life here on Earth could not have developed. The immensity of this cosmos is for us, like it saw us coming. So we zoom out. And we get this perspective. We can contemplate these things. That makes us special. Nothing else in nature can do that. But then we can zoom back in again. Because not only do we have awareness about our immense universe, we also have awareness about us. We are self-conscious beings. We can look at ourselves and ask, what are we? Now that again is something that nothing else in nature does. I defy anyone to tell me that rabbits or sheep in the fields around your county, wherever it is, contemplate their existence. Sheep saying, "No, what am I?" No other part of nature does that, but we do. And I think that too hints at an enchantment that many fail to appreciate. So what are we? Are we human beings with a unique, special existence? Or are we just Homo sapiens? One species among many? Are we something like incarnate angels, or are we just naked apes? My wife said, if I sat here naked and did this lecture tonight, it would go far, it would go viral. I said, no, that's not going to happen. Incarnate angels, naked apes. Are humans endowed with a special enchantment? Or are we just like any other beast with some add-on capacities, like rationality and morality? Are we truly noble or are we ignoble? These are huge and significant questions, and ones that our series is going to grapple with. Now, as we engage these questions, it's interesting to track how we've come to this present moment of disenchantment with ourselves. I call this humanism's descent into disenchantment. Now, this, after all, is the humanist age. It's been going for roughly 500 years. And the humanist age, as the term reflects, is uniquely about us. Now, many of you will know that there are different brands of humanism, which have unique differences, but they all share this. They work in a kind of enlightenment that there's something super special about our race. The first one was back in the 16th century. Beginning of that, you can call this the Renaissance version of humanism, and this was really full of enchantment. It was about the rebirth of the classical heritage. People rediscovered the great philosophers of the classical world, Plato and Aristotle, and it opened up a whole new thing. In the arts, it gave rise to titans like Leonardo and Michelangelo, literally titans. People looked at them and talked about enchantment. These were like gods doing their thing, reproducing the world in their own image. So it was the dawn of human splendor, and Europe celebrated this. Then about a century later, perhaps a bit more, another version of humanism comes along. And this one is actually a direct revolt against God. And that's why we talk about this one as secular humanism. That's where it ends. Now it's up to us as humans to create the brave new world without God or the gods. It's the first attempt ever in history to create a world centered in humans. So we took it on in our agency. We created new democratic orders. We dreamed up new moral orders. And we held on to the promise of unrivaled progress, which was the guarantee that the future is going to be better than the present, and certainly the present is better than the past. So progress is seen as inevitable. With us in charge, with all of our specialness, how couldn't be a better world that's coming? And in so many ways, we have created the better world. It's a better place. Think of all the medical advances that combat disease, food production techniques that combat famine, life expectancy going up all the time. And you could say all these outcomes seem to justify our act of deicide, the death of God, killing them off. And yet, here we get to the descent. Over the past 150 years, the narrative of humanism has been deeply challenged. And slowly and steadily, we've taken the path to disenchantment with our species. And we need to ask why. How do we get from such high levels of enchantment to the pessimism we see today? Well, I actually can think of what I call six shocks that have challenged the humanism project and led us to this growing pessimism. And I'm just going to list them briefly. Each one of these is a lecture. But I wanted to give you the feel of this move towards our present disenchantment. The first actually goes right back to the beginning of the humanism movement, the 16th century. This is the Copernican Revolution. And here's the discovery by Copernicus and others that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. It's just floating around in its sphere amidst an infinite number of other stars. So even as we set out on our humanist path, we were reminded that we are not the center. It was the first shock. The second is the Darwinian Revolution. This takes place much later, the mid-19th century, with Darwin's theory of natural selection, which uncovers a revolutionary truth that humans aren't godlike, but merely elevated apes. It's a demotion in terms of how we view humanness. As Darwin said, we must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man with all his noble qualities still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. It's a demotion. The next revolution I call the Freudian Revolution. And here I'm referring to Freud's discovery of the unconscious, early 20th century. There are depths to our internal life that we're not even aware of, let alone controlling. So as humans, we're not masters of our own house. We're a seething depth of chaos. It's a shock. The fourth I call the Bureaucratic Revolution. And I actually link this idea to Max Weber, sometimes called the father of sociology. He's a contemporary of Freud, and he was actually the first person to introduce the disenchantment thesis. And he wrestled with the idea that modernity had created social conditions that were highly dehumanizing for us. So this was his famous iron cage thesis. Things like industrialization and a growing bureaucracy was having adverse effects on human existence. They were mechanizing us, the Bureaucratic Revolution, another step towards disenchantment. And then the fifth shock was what I call the Great Wars revolutions. Here we come to the 20th century, which witnessed two great wars, wars on a global scale. And no one can actually properly calculate the loss. Probably 120 humans were slaughtered by humans. Now, it would be hard to overestimate what a setback this was for humanism. How do you reconcile all that slaughter with the progress myth that things are getting better? It's hard, the move to disenchantment. Then the sixth shock is simply the environmental disaster that we're confronted with every day in the news today. In the last 50 years, we've become aware of the damage we're doing to our habitat, and it doesn't reflect well on our species. And that too adds to the disenchantment. Here's how the German philosopher Richard David Precht put it. Homo sapiens, which in the past millennia has taken possession of the entire planet and multiplied into billions, is one natural catastrophe among many others. So these six big shocks, and we could name others, have left us with this growing pessimism about ourselves. Clearly, we're not at the center of everything. Our ancestry is from apes. Our internal life is chaos. It's awful living in the iron cage. How have we become so good at killing our own? And here we are responsible for the destruction of our beautiful planet. So back to the central question, what are we as humans? And all of us have to give some kind of account for this question. What are we? What am I? Who am I? Now, here in this introductory talk, I want briefly to highlight three current accounts that are given as an answer to our question. And these three accounts that I'm going to lay out before you are contending with each other. They're fighting for the high ground. And what's remarkable is that some of them ignore the other completely. But I would suggest that these are the three main accounts in terms of an answer to our question. The first two I'm going to share are what we might call secular accounts. They're more recent. And I would say each of these land in a kind of default disenchantment. And then the third account, the one I'll finish on, is the one that dominated Europe for hundreds of years. Lately, it's fallen on hard times. And this is the Christian account. But I would argue that this is the one that truly ennobles us as Christians. Now, before we look at each of these, there's an important point we need to grasp. Our answer to this question, what is a human, always shows a bigger picture in terms of what we believe. Back in the 2nd century, a rather unknown theologian by the name of Theophilus of Antioch said this: "Show me your man, give me your anthropology, and I'll show you your God." It was a way of expressing that there's a link between our anthropology and something greater than us, something we give primacy to, something we name as ultimate, whether that be a divine being or a worldview or an ideology. Show me your view of a person, a human person, and I'll show you something bigger. I'll link the two. That's what Theophilus was saying, and I think he's absolutely right. Whatever answer we give to this question, what is a human, flows from a bigger picture of what we believe reality to be. Now, this is very important to bear in mind, because one needs to be consistent to this larger framework as we probe our question. You can't say, this is what I believe a human is, and be inconsistent to your larger view. They have to go together. So let's get to the first one. Of the three current accounts, the first one I want to talk about briefly is the hardware account. when we ask, what is a human? The answer this account offers is that everything about us belongs to nature. So that makes it a materialist account. Thomas Carlyle, the great public intellectual of Britain in the 19th century, he was a Scot. He read Darwin. He was an incredibly well-read man. And he called Darwin's ideology the gospel of dirt. The gospel of dirt. He was dismissive of it. It just comes down to dirt, to dust. We come from that. It's a materialistic account. Well, in that sense, we can call it a hardware account because it does reduce everything to the material. It believes that everything about a human has a chemical or a biological explanation. And that includes everything. Consciousness, we're going to look at that next week, our very sense of being a self, all our behavior, all of our choices, all of our thoughts have a hardware account in chemistry or biology. So that means that what we are can be fully rendered by the hard sciences. So in terms of a university, it's the science departments, the hard science departments, that has the power to unveil us, to answer the question. Now, Richard David Precht described this as the down-to-earth image of man. He's positive about this. It's down to earth, and it really is. No more pontificating with metaphysics, that is, realities that aren't material. No more wrestling with these things to try and understand ourselves. There's no mystery. There's no hidden wonder to us. We're just hardware to be uncovered. So all we need is empirical proofs to answer the question that we're posing. What is a human? Now, this hardware account of what it means to be human is linked to a hardware account of everything else. It's back to show me your man and I'll show you your God, what you give primacy to. So it works on the foundation of a worldview called naturalism. Roger Trigg, the English philosopher, defines naturalism as the modern version of materialism. And he calls it, rightly, a philosophy that sees reality as defined by that which is within the reach of the sciences. And he goes on. This links the character of the natural world with science's ability to discover it, while not placing limits on the nature of that reality. So only science has the ability to discover the naturalist worlds. The Oxford chemist Peter Atkins upholds that view. He says, the scientific method is the only method of discovering reality. It has not yet encountered a barrier except the one asserted to exist by those fearful of its illumination. Now, I have to say, reading that, it's hard not to see a circular argument there. Basically, Atkins is arguing that if science can't tell us about it, then it doesn't exist. And if you ask, well, why is that? Well, because science can't tell us about it. Well, Peter, that's a very circular argument, resting, I would say, on the religion of science. Show me your man, I'll show you your God. There's the new God. Because everything's hardware, science has to be able to access it. That's how anthropology links to something else, something bigger. Now, what's core to this hardware account is that it makes humans just one species among others, Homo sapiens. It was back in the 18th century that Carl Linnaeus of Sweden became the great classifier. He invented the scientific nomenclature that we use today. And he put humans and chimpanzees in the same genus, Homo sapiens and Homo troglodytes. And actually, in terms of genetic hardware, the DNA of chimpanzees and humans is rather similar. We're told that 98.4% of the human DNA is also chimpanzee DNA, and the two species are about as closely related as horses and donkeys. But the point is this. In the hardware account, we're no more than animals. Sophisticated, yes, but still animals. Homo sapiens. Now today, many of us have a thing for animals. We see them as cute and cuddly, and having 4 children now grown up, I read them lots of stories which enchanted animals, gave them voices and wonderful personalities, and that's okay, but the reality of animals is really rather different. I just have to watch my adorable cat dismembering a mouse to realize, maybe not as cute and cuddly as we think. The Canadian cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker puts this very well. He describes humans in animal terms. What a description. Listen to this or read it. Humans are a gory spectacle in which digestive tracts fitted with teeth at one end are tearing away at whatever flesh they can reach, and at the other end piling up the fuming waste of excrement as they move along in search of more flesh. Not so enchanting. Thomas Ligotti, who's actually a writer of horror fiction, but he has this remarkable background in philosophy, described this like this. Nature coughed you up like a little phlegm from its great lungs. Again, hardly enchanting. Nature coughed you up like a little phlegm from its great lungs. Now, throughout this series, we're going to keep referencing the hardware account because it's very dominant. And we're going to say, does it stand up to the evidence? Can everything about what a human is be reduced to this? And I would say this, and we'll pick this up through the series. If we're no more than hardware, which means in essence machines, it raises the important question, why shouldn't we improve the hardware? We keep doing that with the hardware of our phones and our computers. They grow ever more sophisticated. We've got chips that drive them that become smaller and smaller with nanotechnology. The latest has just come out this week, I'm told, capable of 11 trillion operations a second. That's improved hardware. So if we're hardware, why not do whatever it takes to improve us? And here's where it gets interesting. That's where a guy called Francis Galton, who was the half-cousin of Darwin, that's where he went with this hardware account in the 19th century. Galton is known as the father of eugenics. Eugenics is about good breeding. It's all about improving the genetic quality of the human population. And that includes weeding out the genetically infirmed. And of course, if we know a bit of history, we know what Hitler and the Nazis did with that. That was the rationale for their death camps. Good breeding, eugenics. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to take it that far, but the question remains, if we're just hardware, why not improve ourselves? And that's what transhumanism is proposing. Let's upgrade by merging with the machine. If we're just hardware, why not? Here I'd say it's worth heeding the warning of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant said, if man makes himself a worm, animal species, he mustn't complain when he's trodden on. Much wisdom in that, Dr. Kant. Thank you. That's the first account, the hardware account. The second account I want to look at briefly, I'm calling the software account. And this one is incredibly different from the first one. In fact, they don't even really come into a conversation. Here's the one that dominates the humanities departments of our universities, the social sciences. When it looks at what a human is, it pays almost no attention to biology and instead views us in the social sphere. Steven Pinker, a Canadian cognitive psychologist who's written much on this, commented on this by saying, and behaviorists were as hostile to the brain as they were to genetics. As late as 1974, Skinner wrote that studying the brain was just another misguided quest to find the causes of behavior inside the organism rather than out in the world. And that phrase, out in the world, is key to the software account. Now, Pinker calls this account the blank slate. We're a blank slate until we're stamped out in the world. So if the hardware account weights what we are to nature, the software account weights it to nurture. What we are is how others shape us. And this account keys into a remarkable quality in human beings, and it's our sociability. It's the very quality that we're being denied. For our good, we know, but COVID has actually made sociability something we can't do so well at the moment. But we are fundamentally social beings. And as Yuval Harari reminds us, humans have a cooperative flexibility in terms of the group, Unlike any other species, we live in lots of different groupings: our families, our neighborhoods, our cities, our counties, our countries, the religious affiliation we may have, our football clubs, whatever other club you might belong to. And we can even collaborate across continents to form civilizations. Civilizations operating according to the same basic principles. That can cover billions of people. So that's our collaborative flexibility. Quite remarkable. Now, the software account homes in on this cooperative flexibility and sees that we are fluid beings. To be human is to be fluid. Now, again, show me your man and I'll show you your God starts with us, and then it moves to the conditioning forces of the social realm. It's the conditioning forces that make us. So as humans, we're constantly being conditioned by our social environment. Our fluid software is constantly being programmed and then reprogrammed through our homes and upbringings, through our schools, the educational philosophy of the day, through religion, through media. All these are shaping what we are. They're programming us. Now, where traditionally nurture was seen in a positive light, so you think about the job of parents is to nurture their children in the home for good. Today, it's seen with increasing negativity and pessimism. It's all rooted in a hermeneutic of suspicion. Power is seen to be at the root of everything socially. And every human is the victim of misappropriated power. So the software account is deeply cynical about what humans are. We are being socially constructed by something bad and something menacing. So here's an account that bypasses, I think, other obvious aspects of sociability. Yes, power functions in relationship, but there's also human kindness. You still see it everywhere. You see trust, deep trust that exists between people in local communities. You see beautiful loyalties that hold people together. Men and women, parents to children, to aunties, to uncles, to friendships. And that's why I see the modern software account, which is basically Foucaultian, seeing the power play at the basis of everything. It's another form of disenchantment. All of us are just victims of bad programming. The kind of programming that makes us see our gender, whatever that is, our race, our sexuality, our history as distorted. And it's a viewpoint that makes for an awful lot of grievance. Our establishments today are really functioning in this software account. And it's pushing us to a breakdown of trust. Human existence is about bad power. It's a really grim picture. And I would say this software account has become the new secular religion, especially in the modern university. We are being programmed by people who have power over us, and we have to deconstruct it because we're just fluid. That's what we are. Now, there are those who take this view of what a human is, and they say, because we're software, we should use the power of conditioning to produce something good, a good society. So let's create the right conditions to reprogram us. One of the great advocates of this in the last century was B.F. Skinner, still very influential in terms of thought. He was an American psychologist and social philosopher who came up with a philosophy known as behaviorism. And he gives you the science of that in his book, Science and Human Behavior, which I recently read. He also wrote a novel, which I read recently, called Walden 2. Don't bother, it's not that good. But it's about a utopian community that operated to the best scientific principles of conditioning. And in that utopia, everyone did well. Now, rightly, many see this as incredibly naive, because the threat to conditioning is what C.S. Lewis calls the power of the few over the many. It always comes down to that. It's what's going on today with what's known as surveillance capitalism. If you haven't watched it yet, get on your Netflix and watch The Social Dilemma. It's all about conditioning. The few, Google, Facebook, using their software power to condition us in subtle ways. They're targeting our perception to manipulate us through their adverts according to their financial interests. Now, this software account, which is so popular today, raises important questions. Are we no more as humans than software to be reprogrammed? Is that a sufficient picture of what a human is? And then finally, the third account, the Imago Dei account. When we ask, what is a human? The answer to this is we are the image of God. And this is the account rendered in the Bible, in Genesis 1:27, we're told God made them, Adam and Eve, in his own image. And Genesis 2:7 gives a beautiful picture of how this happens. We're told the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. So note, something is breathed into us. The Spirit of God is breathed into us. It's quite a contrast to Ligotti's picture of nature coughing us out like a bit of phlegm from its lungs. So here's the Genesis account. We're both of the dust, says this verse, and we're also of God, who breathes into us. As Abraham Heschel puts it, man is continuous both with the rest of organic nature and with the infinite outpouring of the Spirit of God. A minority in the realm of being. He stands somewhere between God and the beasts. That's what Genesis 2:7 reflects. Now, whatever objections you might have, if you do have one to this biblical account, we can say this view enchants. And this is God's account of what we are. It's how he answers our question. Abraham Heschel wrote something very, very insightful on this matter. He says, the Bible is primarily not man's vision of God, but God's vision of man. The Bible's not man's theology, but God's anthropology. And I think that is spot on. And it's this enchanted, ennobling view of what a human is, which was essential to the founding of Western civilization. The Indian thinker and philosopher Vishal Mangalwadi argues that the greatest discovery of the West was the inherent worth and dignity of every human person. That was our great discovery. And he says it didn't come from the Greeks and the Romans. He's absolutely right there. Rather, it came from the Bible's answer, God's anthropology of what it is to be human, one rooted in being the image of God. Again, the Hebrew poet who asked the question we're addressing in Psalm 8 put it like this: you made us a little lower than the angels and crowned us with glory and honor. That's an enchanted, ennobling view. Now, this image metaphor that describes what we are is an intriguing one to ponder, and we're not going to do much with it tonight. Theologians wrestle deeply with its meaning. But taking the word for what it actually means, an image is a representation. And representations, pictures, statues, always point beyond themselves. An image points to something other. And in that sense, an image is nothing in itself. What you see in the mirror first thing in the morning might not attract you much, but it's only there because you're there. It's nothing of itself. And it's interesting, as philosophers have wrestled with the reality of representations and images, one thing they tell you rightly is how elusive they are. It's pretty hard to tie it down. And this reminds us of the elusive nature of a human. We are the imago Dei, the image of God. And I suggest that when we give this as the answer to the question, we are the imago Dei, we're retaining the mystery and wonder of who we are and what we are. Chaim Potok, the Hasidic Jewish novelist and rabbi philosopher, wrote this: the most mysterious thing in the universe to man is man himself. Then listen to Dostoevsky. Man is a mystery. It needs to be unraveled. And if you spend your whole life unraveling it, don't say that you've wasted time. I am studying that mystery because I want to be a human being. Fyodor, what a quote. So the reason why there's enchantment in this third account is because it asserts that no matter how hard you try, you'll never fully uncover what we are. And that's because we image a God who himself is beyond human comprehension. So it means we're not essentially our hardware, oh, that's part of what we are. Neither are we essentially our software, although we can be conditioned and are conditioned by factors and social forces outside of us. But we're not essentially these things. It doesn't answer the question. So to open our eyes to what a human is reveals this. And especially as we zoom out, we see this mystery. As Heschel puts it again, we're stuck with an awareness of the immense preciousness of being. A preciousness which is not an object of analysis, but a cause of wonder. And I believe this account is the inference to the best explanation of what we are. And in this series, we're going to unpack it and see the wonder of the various capacities God has given us. The American poet Emily Dickinson wrote this: "Life is a spell so exquisite that everything conspires to break it." And I would say that is true of a human life. And there's so much conspiring to break the spell of what a human is. And I would suggest secular humanism is now showing itself to be utterly bankrupt in its vision of what we are. And now is the time for a re-enchantment of Homo sapiens, and it has to happen before it's too late. Because if we continue to act on the basis of the first and the second accounts, the hardware one, the software one, who knows where it's going to take us? It could turn us into mechanical robots or zombies who are conditioned through social forces, perhaps especially social media. And that's why we need the counterspell to restore the better account the Bible gives, the one it offers, the one which is the basis for our nobility. So in other talks, I want to offer this counterspell. Next week, we're going to be looking at our internal life, the wonder of human consciousness, and reflect on what that says about us. Well, thank you for listening again. Wish you were here. I hope you, as Josh said, had a hot drink in your hand or a glass of wine. And I look forward to a bit of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that presentation. I neglected to mention at the beginning that the plan for this evening is to have our presentation and then allow a 5-minute intermission because we realize it's fairly labor intensive watching a screen. During this 5 minutes, do feel free to tap in some questions into the Q&A tab, or indeed when we resume at 25 minutes past 8, feel free to raise your hand if you'd prefer to do it verbally, and I will give you the mic. But there's 5 minutes now. Please feel free to pour yourself another mug of Horlicks or whatever your preference is, and we will reconvene at 8:25. Wonderful. Let's move to Q&A. As I mentioned, please do use the Q&A tab. You should also be able to raise your hand if you'd like to contribute a question. I'll try and keep an eye out for those who have raised hands. But we've got some questions, Andrew. Are you there?
I am here, yes.
Fantastic stuff.
Digitally here.
Let's link a couple of these questions together. We've got a couple of similar questions that would be good to put to you. And they pick up something I was wondering, Andrew, as we went along, because, of course, pantheism has also been an influence, particularly from the mid-20th century in the West. And Jesse Voth says, within the 3 ways of looking at humanity that you describe, where would you place the rise in the obsession with pantheism, psychedelic experience, and neo-paganism over the last 30 or more years? And he thanks you for a great lecture. I'm going to link that to a question from Sarah Hudson Davies, who asks, do these 3 accounts cover the West only or the East as well?
Very good. Just writing this down. I'm just lost my glasses. Lovely to hear familiar names mentioned. Yeah, so in a sense, much of that was linking Eastern views, some of which have had an influence in the West. How does that feed into the matter of what it means to be human? Is that the question? Am I understanding the question correctly?
Essentially, I think you are.
Yeah. I would say in the 80s and 90s sort of new age spirituality was huge. And I think it's morphed and shifted. Someone used the word neo-paganism into a retrieval of ancient paganisms, which I think fit into kind of the new environmental ideology, where nature is divinized, and we find our identity in a connection to nature. So I think there's something real going on there. I actually think it doesn't get to the nub of the question, what is a human? I don't think neo-paganism does what ancient paganism does, which was actually worked by totems. So when you asked, what am I? You actually pinned the answer to that on something within nature. You might have been Wolfman or Batwoman. So in that sense, there really was a sense that you were a part of nature. I would say since the rise of humanism, it's almost impossible for us to conceptualize ourselves like that anymore. We are now apart from nature, A-P-A-R-T, apart rather than a part. They're two different, two completely different ways of conceptualizing ourselves. So I think it's influential, but I'm not sure it gets to the nub of the question in terms of a serious engagement with who we are. But it is prominent today, and I think neo-paganism grows. I've read quite a bit about it over the years, and it's a little bit like some forms of Zen Buddhism. It's a bit postmodern, piecemeal. It takes what it likes and mixes it together, but I'm not sure how much integrity it has.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Andrew. We've got, again, two similar questions. One from Nicola, who asks, please could you explain or define what you mean by enchantment and why is it important? And likewise, we've got one from James Goodwin Hudson. He says, what do you mean by enchantment? Is it similar to Charles Taylor and his secular age?
Yeah, so a clear definition of enchantment. Yeah, I mean, it does link to Charles Taylor and his work on the subject. I don't think it's really possible to enchant anything without the realm of the supernatural. It's pretty hard to aspire to wonder over something if you're in a flat plane of the merely mechanical. So I would say enchantment adds dimensions to our perception of something that has a transcendent aspect to us and leads us to wonder. So it's, in a sense, the elevation of something in our estimation, in our esteem, where disenchantment goes the opposite direction. It brings us down. Yeah. It's not only about perception. The way Max Weber used it, his disenchantment theory was just about a mechanized life, where it was again hard to appreciate the wonder.
That's helpful. Got an interesting question, an anonymous question. If you were talking to an atheist, how would you define a human being to him? You quoted Peter Atkins earlier. What would you say to a Peter Atkins or to an atheist?
Yeah, well, I think I want the conversation first. I'd enjoy the question and want to sit down and tussle with it. But I would put the challenge back and say, do you think as an atheist, and I think an atheist almost has to be a naturalist in terms of their fundamental worldview, do you really think that you can account for a human being fully on your own terms? And of course, many would say, we might get there in the end, but many would say with respect to the probing of consciousness, the probing of our mental life, that we haven't even got near a kind of hardware account of that. In fact, the more we probe it, the more questions we raise and bring up. And some of the models that were common 20 years ago, the computational model of how consciousness works, have just been discarded. So there's still the hope, with a naturalist on their own terms has to have this hope that it's hardware will get there, but at the moment it's not happening. So I might point that up, and that's something I'm going to be uncovering through this whole series. There's just a vast number of things connected to humanness that just don't seem to fit into the naturalist account very well at all.
Got a question from Ranald Macaulay. Of the two alternatives, the hardware and software, which do you feel is the more dangerous? The latter seems more political. Is this a factor, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ronald. Greetings. I think they're both enormously dangerous. I think Lewis in Abolition of Man is largely looking at the software account. He's the one who talks a lot about the conditioners. And yeah, he thought that it could end in an utter catastrophe. He also, without using the language of transhumanism, talked about our overcoming human nature in a kind of technical way. So I wouldn't say one or the other is more dangerous. I think they're both potential abolition of what it means to be a human being. And I think what's so frightening is that they're both occurring in quite separate spheres. So I look at a university and the humanities department, everything's a social construction. It's just a million miles away from the science departments, which is the hardware account. And someone like E.O. Wilson is trying to bring the science and humanities into a conversation with each other, but I find his argument quite weak. But I just want to iterate. I think both of them are extremely dangerous. Probably the one that has the furthest reach potentially is the software one, because it's controlled by those who have political power, and today even more those who have media power. And although I think we should take transhumanism seriously, I have huge doubts about some of the claims they make in terms of the future. So, okay, I'm going to opt, thanks for the question. I'm going to opt and say they're both terribly dangerous, but probably software is the one we should be most wary of.
I think you've hinted that one of the dangers is that neither takes account of the other. There is this rift. And
they can't take account of each other because they're such disparate accounts. John Gray does a good job of highlighting that they're both completely incompatible. He thinks it's one of the great absurdities of our time. But I think trying to bring the two together is something I'm interested in, because I think they both fall apart when you do bring them together.
Thanks very much, Andrew. We've got questions trickling in, which is lovely. Here we are. So picking up on that, I suppose, is Anna from Spain. Thanks you for the wonderful lecture. And she says, can we learn anything from the hardware and software account that allows us a more comprehensive understanding of what we are as human beings? So perhaps could you develop that, Andrew?
Yeah.
I know you're going in subsequent weeks, but can you give us a taster?
Yeah, absolutely. Both of them have a great deal to offer in terms of understanding what a human is. We are embodied creatures, fearfully and wonderfully made. And the complexity of our brains is something that I think neurology is wonderfully beginning to unravel. And so there's so much we can learn. But this is where I bring in Theophilus of Antioch. When one's anthropology links to this theology, if I can call it that, this larger view, and that becomes its reduction, then you have a problem. So hardware account, wonderful. The software account, absolutely. I think understanding the influence that our social settings have on us is imperative. In a sense, psychology, a lot of what it works with. Someone has a difficulty, and you go back to the family history. You look at the nurture and say, oh, there's explanatory power in terms of why this person is like this. So I think both of them are wonderful, but not as reductions. So it's not the answer to this is what we are. It's part of the answer. But that's why I said, then, we're not essentially these things. But for me, I can't learn too much. I'm constantly wanting to learn more from the biological science, especially at the moment neurology. It's just utterly fascinating. And I love sociology because it does give explanatory power to what we are. But as reductions, no.
Thanks so much. From Theophilus of Antioch to David Hume.
David Hume's on the line.
David Hume's with us. It's more of a comment than a question, I think. David Hume said you can't derive an ought from an is, and without realizing it, demonstrated the strict limited nature of science, which only deals with what is and can say no more. I think that's called the naturalistic fallacy.
Yep.
I suppose that's more of a comment, but a comment perhaps could be directed against someone like B.F. Skinner. Do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, perhaps. Although I think Hume and Skinner were coming from quite different. Well, they were both interested in the scientific method as a way of understanding human behavior. But at the end of the day, Skinner was a psychologist, where Hume's a philosopher, and he's also a philosopher interested in the empirical. He wants to see wants to see how things work out in the real world. So some similarities, but I think significant differences too. But again, Hume just up front discounted the possibility of the miracle, of the supernatural. That was so a little bit like the Atkins quote I make. It's the starting point. It can't be questioned because there's no empirical proof for this. It's discounted, and that's my problem.
Someone once described Richard Dawkins as the grumpiest man in Britain, which I think was a huge disservice to Peter Atkins.
David Hume was pretty grumpy too.
Yes, some stiff competition. Let's go to a question from, I'm sorry, I'm going to get the name wrong, but Klaus Buert, who has a very interesting question here. Yeah. If the cosmic coincidences that are essential for life are accidents, then we are accidents. Mm-hmm. Is there a view that they are necessary, in which case we, as conscious beings within the universe, are necessary too?
Yeah,
if the latter, then I think that has huge implications for who we are. Mm. If we are the only beings, as you described earlier, Andrew, who are aware of ourselves, able to ask these questions, and implications for what the universe is.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Yeah, I think that was from a Trigg quote, wasn't it? Roger Trigg, a philosopher of religion. And yeah, I mean, the argument for fine tuning, I think, is quite well accepted by physicists, cosmologists, and what does one do with that? It's just a fact that the amount of carbon we need to survive is such a slender edge in terms of what's required that tip it one way or the other, a fraction, and life doesn't exist. So we just know that it seems that this planet we're on was fine-tuned for our existence, linking to other planets and stars. So that just then leaves the question. Trigg used the word coincidentally, accidental, or of necessity. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, is there a design or is it an accident? If it's an accident, poof, it's a remarkable one. And there are philosophers, Thomas Oden being one of them, who recognizes that the conditions for life are almost impossible, and yet they're here. What do we make of that? But it's an excellent question. But that's just another question we've got to answer. Accidental or by design?
Our friend Jack Harding asks, do you see a connection between our faulty anthropologies and the deteriorating public conversation among those with different worldviews and views?
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I do. I mean, in a sense, part of the noise I talked about in the software account is just the lack of trust, the suspicion that anyone, certainly in authority, are just conditioning us and trying to get one over on us. But I think the bad temperedness of the public square Yeah, is fed by the pessimism, is fed by the disenchantment. You read Thomas Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, and I admired the book. He's actually trying to be consistent to his presupposition that we're self-conscious nothings. But if you really believe that, it's not going to put a smile on your face very often when you meet others in public. So I think the disenchantment is feeding over. I think we're feeling the unease, the depression, the gloom. There's lots of factors that feed that, but I think this is a hugely significant part of it. I think it's having a terrible impact on mental health. And how could it not?
That's really interesting. I'm going to link two questions again. No, maybe I'm going to ask them separately. I don't want to prejudice your answer. Another question from Ranald. Your outline of the growing fragmentation over the past 2 centuries is right, but where is it all going? Schaeffer was clear that societies can't take too much of that, so he warned about the growth of centralized power.
Yeah, I mean, is that referring to the 6 shocks? Is the gradual shocks to secular humanism leading to disenchantment? Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it has fragmented, but I would say the 6 shocks aren't primarily about fragmentation; they're about disenchantment. And I agree with Schaeffer. I think the chaos, out of the anarchy, if you can put it like that, a tyranny will emerge. And Schaeffer's wonderful phrase, "When truth retreats, tyranny advances," I think is spot on. So the positive confidence that humanism started in, I think is retreating rather quickly. I didn't say it in this talk, but I think where the positivity is fed now is into what I call technohumanism. That's actually Yuval Harari's phrase, but I think we're entering a new kind of humanism where the positive can be unleashed now on the technical side. And of course, again, only a few have that power to wield. So I think in the end, it's centralized again.
We'll make this the last question. Anna asks, to what extent can COVID-19 mean a 7th revolution?
Yes, it's an excellent question. I think it is another shock. For me, COVID-19 has, I think, reflected the serious shortcomings of scientism as a controlling mechanism for getting anywhere. Our politicians tell us that we're being led by science, but actually a lot of it is being very rush science. And some of the best thinkers in this have said that rush science is always bad science. But of course, hard science can only give us part of the picture when it comes to this dreadful virus. There's lots of other factors that have nothing to or little to do with the hard science, like loneliness and old people locked up in their homes. So I think one needed a much broader anthropological vision in terms of what a human is to actually do well with this. And I think to say we're just being led by science has showed the poverty of that approach. It's doing something. I'm sure they'll get a vaccine in the end, but it's not the silver bullet to solve the whole thing. And I actually hope out of this, we'll see that as wonderful as science is, it needs a whole range of outlooks and disciplines to do well. But I think it's a terrible shock in terms of progress. This virus that starts in the East basically closes down the world. That gives us pause to say, whew, what happened? Why didn't we anticipate it? Where is this going? So I think it is another shock. So it's a very good point. Thank you.
It's perhaps a good note to end on, as when we discussed this series, we noted it has been quite a year for our view of the human, with Black Lives Matter, with COVID and all of its challenges. So please do join us next week as we continue the series. Next week's title is The Interior Castle, a view from the inside. And Andrew's going to be grabbing the bull of consciousness by its horns and talking us through the issues of our own consciousness as human beings and what that might point to. Thank you, Andrew, ever so much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for being with us.
Yes.
Hope it's been a really helpful time. It's been great to be with you. And we hope to see you next week. And if just say in closing, if you do know anyone who would appreciate the chance, just to retreat and for a time and think about what it is to be human with us over the next few weeks, we would love for them to join us. So please do feel free to share the info about next week and the ensuing discussions. Thank you ever so much. And for now, we'll say goodbye.
Farewell.
Thanks very much.